Hey there, thanks for tuning into Duckbricks. I'm Chris, and well, as thanks to the LEGO Ambassador Network, I just got out of an interview with some of the LEGO set designers for the Avatar Way of Water Wave, and I am incredibly excited to share everything I learned over the course of the interview with all of you. So as you know, Avatar The Way of Water just released, and I've had the chance to actually go through and build each of the sets, from the majestic kind of Tulkun whale right here. We've also got a lot of the smaller creatures. There was a lot of variety in the Avatar Wave 2 sets, and it was such a joy to be able to talk to the LEGO designers and kind of talk through exactly what they thought in terms of when they were putting together the sets, talk about the modularity, the development, how they brought back the mold of the older woody long leg mold. There is so much stuff to cover here, so without further ado, let's just jump right into it. I essentially will be talking through all of the questions that I asked, the questions that other registered LEGO fan media sites and YouTubers asked as well, and kind of compiling all of that into this one video, where we will talk through all of the responses they gave to my questions regarding how these sets themselves were developed. And so, without further ado, let's just jump right into the video. Alright, so let's just get started here. I'm going to frame this video by first talking through my personal questions. I had a list of questions that I personally sent in and just kind of found interesting that I thought folks would be interested in knowing. And this was a roundtable discussion, so there were a lot of other questions that came from other folks, so I'll be covering those as well and pretty much giving every single bit of information that we found out through this entire roundtable interview, because there were a lot of really interesting things that we learned here. Now, a few clarifications. I did have to revise some of my questions. Number one, I was not allowed to ask any questions about cost or budget, so I could not ask any questions about that. I could not ask any questions related to weapons, so I had a few questions about LEGO drawing a line on depicting realistic weapons, like the AMP suit and whatnot. Could not ask anything about that, so could not talk about that. And I also asked about, or I wanted to ask about any sort of future, maybe modules to add on to the world of Pandora, especially if they make more sets off the first movie. However, for obvious reasons, they cannot discuss future projects, so we couldn't ask about any of those. Otherwise though, aside from budget, weapons, and future stuff, pretty much everything was on the table. So let's go ahead and get into things. Specifically, we talked to two different LEGO designers. We talked to Niels Fredriksson, who's been with the company for 10 years, first on the Star Wars team and then later on for Jurassic World and now Avatar, as well as Solvita, who was the first LEGO designer from Latvia, which is really cool. So after talking to both of them, I'm just going to go through the questions I had here. I'll be playing some of my LEGO Avatar review content in the background, and this is mostly just going to be free form, talking through the process of the questions that I asked and sharing some details on their answers. So the first question I had was that LEGO Avatar made waves by bringing back the discontinued Toy Story long legs and arm molds, again which came out from Woody. What is the process of resurrecting an old mold and updating it for modern use? Is it just like creating a new piece from scratch? I had a few questions pertaining to budget around that, but I just couldn't ask those, so that was kind of the question. And essentially what they were saying was that this basically was just like creating a new mold. They still had some of the older molds all the way back when they were first releasing the Toy Story sets around the 2011 timeframe, so they still had the older 3D models. Obviously those molds had been destroyed, so they did not have those molds anymore whatsoever. But what they had to do was take the existing 3D models for those older molds and kind of just have to go back and recreate them from scratch. They made some very minor modifications to the exact dimensions to kind of update them and bring them into the modern era, but it was essentially like creating new molds from scratch, even though they're basically kind of super similar. So to quote their element lead, they said that they still had the former geometries from the old 3D model, but there were a variety of aspects that have been developed over the years, so molds, materials, and standards have all changed since 2011 and back in the day when they were doing Toy Story sets, so they have a lot of valuable knowledge from past years, and while they still had the idea behind the old element, they didn't have the old molds, and what they did was they just basically did it completely over again. So they went off of it and used the jumping off point for the Woody legs, but it was like creating a brand new piece from scratch. I would assume, this was not explicitly stated, but I would assume that the budget was basically just like creating a new piece from scratch, given that they not only had to modify the 3D model for it, but they also had to basically just remake the mold entirely. Moving on to the next question, I asked, the Na'vi used specialized head, hair, and tail elements to depict their uncommon shapes. Was there ever a point in development where they were done with standard minifigures, and what influenced this decision to make them customized characters basically from head to toe?
So that was the question I asked, and their answer was that they actually tried out a lot of different types of things. They actually tried to go with both normal minifigures, both for humans and avatars and Na'vi, and they even tried like minifigures for the Na'vi and Avatar, like standard minifigs, and then micro figures for the humans, but that didn't really work. They felt the scale just wasn't correct there, and they really did want to showcase the height disparity between the Na'vi and the Avatars compared to humans, and that was one thing that was really, really important to them because it's obviously a focus of how they're different, so therefore the choice kind of landed on them going with the longer legs as well as longer arms to go with them all. So that was kind of the main basis behind it. I'm very curious what those prototypes looked like of trying to create like a mini or micro figure for standard humans to go alongside the Lego minifigure like regular style Na'vi. I think that would have looked pretty cursed, so I'm pretty happy with what they eventually came up with. The next question that I asked was that a lot of the first movie sets utilize vibrant foliage and unique landscaping, which some fans have found familiar and reminiscent of Lego elves. Was this ever an influence on the design of these two very different themes? So that was kind of a question that I asked, and their exact answer was not intentionally. However, when they started up the project, they did have a couple of small design boost sessions where they invited designers in from other projects to help to sketch various concepts, one of which was the foliage and landscaping. They don't remember if any of the designers were on Lego Elves took part in the boost, but they might have been, and thereby there could have been an influence of some sort. Also, they see a lot of other project sketch models around the office every day, so they seek inspiration in those, just as what you would see and observe around outside the office as well. So while there wasn't any direct influence from stuff like Lego Elves, it very much could have influenced it if designers from that team participated in the roundtable. And the next question I asked was, many of the Wave 1 sets were meant to be modular, featuring the clip system to combine sets, whereas the second movie sets opted to instead depict different depths of the ocean by using the hexagonal squares and forego this modular system. What went into the decision-making process of making the clips be able to connect all the land parts, but really not going for that for the water parts? And this was actually a really good answer because I was really curious kind of what drove that decision, and the exact explanation that they gave was that for the first wave, they were made to be modular, and the second wave was specifically separate. And the reason for that was because they wanted all the bases to sort of connect physically, but not actually connect via any connection points. What they wanted to keep throughout the line was just to keep the octagonal base. The reason for this was to give people more freedom in displaying the pieces and models in the way that they want. And one of the most important things is that a lot of these sets focus on really large creatures, like Pyakon the Tulkun and the Mako submarine. All of those are really big. And if you wanted to actually have the bases clip on to other bases, that would have also meant that the bases that they use would have had to be much wider and encompass the entire space to actually allow them to click onto any other set. So that was a big reason behind it, because it simply would have just been harder for people to be able to connect them unless the bases were massive, which definitely would have taken on and added a lot onto the price. The other reason was that for water, they wanted to do more of a fluid design and make things less rigid like the land, and again, with the way of water being the theme, they wanted to be able to kind of just allow you to spread out your play scenario a little bit more and change the play scenario for the water stuff. The next question that I asked, that was a really good answer to that one, but the next one I asked was, I wanted to ask a few questions regarding how they actually were able to create the different creatures. Obviously, they used mostly vinyl pieces for creating the creatures themselves, but I was curious why they didn't use fabric or brick-built wings, particularly for the Banshees or even some of the skim wings or later creatures. What went into the decision to using the vinyl elements and not fabric or brick-built? So the answer was that they did explore a variety of different versions. They did try brick-built wings, they did try fabric, they did try foil, and eventually the reason why they eventually landed on foil or vinyl was because they really wanted to express the graphics in the best possible way, because they felt that they couldn't print as vibrant of colors on the fabric, and also doing it brick-built, they couldn't quite get the patterns of the wings, so they wanted the visual reflectivity of the pieces to reflect kind of the shimmer of a lot of the wings there. And one thing that they liked about the Avatar Way of Water builds is that the foils kind of look like they're wet, so for these sea creatures it kind of feels like they just jumped out of the water. And lastly, as a practical aspect, the foil wings are much more lightweight, especially compared to brick-built wings. It would have been a lot heavier, and they would have had to change around the way the joints attach, which is why eventually they ended up in foil. Another question that was asked not by me, but by another member of the team, was they actually asked about specifically why did they not bring back the pieces from the LEGO crowdfunded Forma set, which were essentially pieces that were made to be a lot more slim in their profile to be able to actually connect onto foil or vinyl pieces. And essentially the answer was that they just didn't know that those pieces existed and they weren't really available to them. If I had to imagine, that was pretty limited in terms of a production run. In case you aren't aware, Forma was a Kickstarter project that LEGO did where people could actually tend to crowdfund these particular koi fish models and whatnot in order to build them. It was a really weird type of Kickstarter project. LEGO has never really done that before, but that was kind of how it was. So that was why they didn't really know those pieces were available, which is totally fair. I'm sure those are no longer in existence in the LEGO portfolio anymore. Next up, I asked how long was the Avatar line in development, and did this take longer than usual themes because of the innovations of minifigure design or having to work with an IP partner? So they actually answered this pretty quickly. Time-wise, it was fairly normal. It was a typical development time for an IP project line. They started last year in September, so September of 2021, and that was basically when they were starting to work on the sets. They worked on both waves simultaneously. So it was around September they started all the sketch work and exploration of 2021, and then about a year later they started to release the sets. So that was pretty nice. They had a few things in-house already because the first movie sets were developed a little bit earlier than September. So September was mostly for the Way of Water stuff, so that was pretty okay. And they did also get a bit of extra time because the movie was delayed by a year, so they had to delay all the products by a year as well, which meant that they had a lot of leeway and extra time to finalize some things. They didn't have a lot of extra time, but they had a little bit because they had to work on some other stuff. So, that was basically the amount of time that they had. So those were all the questions that I personally asked, but there were a lot of other questions that other folks asked, specifically regarding to the functional bow piece, as opposed to using the regular crossbow or just like a regular archery bow, and what was the process coming up with that? And that question came from other LEGO fan media, and the answer was that this was an idea that had kind of been bubbling up in the minds of one of their element designers for a while, but he needed a project that actually necessitated a firing bow piece to use, and they didn't really have any sort of project in the pipeline and needed it until Avatar came on. And they felt it made sense because the Na'vi are not using like high-tech tools or equipment, so they wanted this more old-style bow to fit in for the playability and play experience. And they actually stated that during one of the play testing scenarios, it was really funny because they had two kids who were given this set, and all they did were, for basically an hour, just playing around with the bow. For a whole hour, two kids played with the bow straight and shooting it, and they completely forgot about the brick-built models. They were so into the bows. And that was part of what went into the decision of actually making a new element for that piece, because kids loved it so much, they even forgot about playing with the brick-built models themselves and just focused on playing with the bow. So that was obviously one really big thing that they wanted to include in the line, and given that it was so popular during playtests, it makes sense to include. The other question that was asked was there anything that was learned from the first line that was carried into the second one, or maybe something that they saw that didn't work as well that they wanted to alter? So what they said was that they actually had the new designer come in just for the Avatar Way of Water sets. Specifically, Solvita came in for the Way of Water sets, whereas Niels worked on both of them, and she was able to provide a really unique perspective into designing the sets. That's why sometimes some of the Way of Water sets feel a little bit different in terms of the play patterns compared to the first wave, and it was really interesting because they had a lot of trial and error by developing the first movie wave, by fitting in the Na'vi and the longer minifigures and whatnot. So basically, it was pretty easy to just get some internal feedback from all of these different kinds of testing for the first wave. They had a big roundtable of all different talented designers across the LEGO group to give their own input into it, so it definitely was an iteration upon the first wave. The next one was that, let me see, what were the other questions? They were asked, what are some of the challenges that they faced, and maybe something that they were proud of to carry through to the final design? So there were a lot of challenges because they wanted to work on it simultaneously with while the movie was being developed. And obviously that is always a difficult process, but what they actually did was that the Avatar movie team sent them early clips of the movie itself that they could watch and be able to build the sets off of. So they were able to get really good reference models for the movies even well before the movies released, which is pretty cool because they mentioned that for stuff like, say, Star Wars, they don't get stuff like that, presumably because Star Wars movies are like last minute in development later on as compared to Avatar, which seemed like it was ready for a while. So they actually sent Lego clips of the movie that they could build sets off of, which is why the sets are actually just so good in terms of being accurate to the movies. Another thing they were really proud of was the new Site 26 wheelchair piece. They actually made a modification to the wheelchair to allow it to actually go through doors, because that was something that you couldn't do with the older wheelchair, which felt like a big miss, that you can't actually wheel them through the standard kind of simple Lego door frame. So they remolded the wheelchair for the Avatar line, and that is now pretty much just the standard wheelchair being used in all sorts of different Lego sets, which is a really good thing because while the older wheelchair mold was great, it couldn't fit through doors. So this is definitely a major improvement, and that was something they were really proud of, finally being able to update the wheelchair to do that. Now, that was pretty much all of the questions. There were a few other ones, but those were the big ones. There were a lot of questions surrounding around working with an IP and with Avatar. What they basically talked about with the original movie, given that it has been out for many years, it was a lot easier to make sets for that, and it was easier than other movies because for aquatic stuff, they got the clips in advance. One of the challenges was doing the shaping and stability of the aquatic builds for the organic shapes and creatures, and obviously the Mako submarine was a little bit easier because that's more of a mechanical thing as compared to the other creatures, but that was definitely something that they had to figure out in terms of doing recolors, like the carrots for the underwater foliage. That was a really important thing, and one thing that they said was across the entire Avatar lineup, there are 43 new color changes. So across all of Avatar, they had the budget to recolor 43 new elements, which is absolutely insane. That is kind of an unheard of budget, but yeah, I mean, obviously they're wanting to do it for a big movie project, and that was something that was really interesting. And honestly, that was pretty much it. There were a couple other questions in terms of like their favorite sets and whatnot. They talked a lot about the smaller sets being highlights, and there didn't really feel like there were a lot of limitations with the IP because there were so many things that they could cover. So pretty much that was basically how it worked, and I believe that sums up pretty much every single question that we asked. It was a really fun time. This was my very first roundtable interview with any sort of Lego designer ever done, so it was a great experience chatting with them, and I hope that this was helpful to you. I have actually been able to transcribe the video, and I've put a transcription as a Google Doc in the description of this video if you just want to read the actual transcription. That being said, I'm going to be honest, it's not a very good transcription. There are a lot of misspelled names and words, and it's kind of hard to tell who says what, but if you do want to hear just the exact transcription for the interview itself, I have pasted that below, as well as a few other questions that were asked after the interview, which I have pasted down below as well. So definitely feel free to check that out if you do want. It is admittedly a little bit hard to parse through. There's just a wall of text here with not really any clear denotation on who's saying what and whatnot, but I mean, if you read through it, you can kind of get a sense of the flow of the conversation if you would prefer to read a document rather than to actually watch this video. And with that, we have summed up my roundtable interview with the Avatar Lego designers. I hope you've enjoyed, and in the future, I will be polling my community for questions to ask Lego designers in advance, because I feel like that would be a really cool thing to do.
Alright, and with that, we have summed up our interview with the LEGO Avatar set designers. I hope you've enjoyed this special insight into the development process behind a new LEGO theme. It was such a blast being able to chat with them, and it was a really good time. And in the future, let me know down in the comments below if there are any specific theme designers you want me to talk to, or any questions you have for LEGO designers. Do let me know, because I definitely want to be doing more interviews in the future. Now, to be completely honest, through LAN, I don't really have a choice in terms of who I get interviews with. I was basically told that I had an interview with the LAN and I could either accept it or not, so obviously I accepted, but I will let them know and see if there's any chance for me to be able to do any more interviews. And I definitely do want to let you know, because it was such a blast interviewing the creators of such amazing sets like these. This is easily already one of my favorite LEGO Avatar sets, and probably might even be one of the best ones in general. It's just so fun to be able to see the thought process behind putting together creatures like this, and I hope you've enjoyed these interviews. Thank you all so much for tuning into Duckbricks. Be sure to stay tuned for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon, and bye for now.